Sydney Garden Slug Dare. Sam Ballard was a 19-year-old rugby player with a future, and the dare he took on a friend's patio one night in 2010 would keep him paralyzed for 8 years before it finally killed him. The evening had begun the way countless Sydney evenings begin. Red wine and friends gathered on the concrete patio at Jimmy Galvin's home in the suburbs, the kind of weekend gathering nobody expected to make the international news. A garden slug crawled across the patio, slow and unremarkable, and Sam was dared to eat it. He swallowed it live. Within days, the pain set in, severe and bilateral, both legs aching in a way that wouldn't quit, and the vomiting and the dizzy spells came on hard enough that his mother Katie rushed him to the hospital. The diagnosis was rat lungworm disease, caused by a nematode called Angiostrongylus cantonensis that lives in rodent feces, gets eaten by slugs and snails, and then climbs up the human nervous system if anyone is unlucky enough to ingest the carrier. Sam fell into a coma, and he didn't come out for 420 days. When he finally woke, he was paralyzed from the neck down. He could control his breathing and his eyelids, and nothing else. His mother, Katie, became his full-time caregiver, taking over every aspect of his daily life because there was nothing about it he could still do on his own. And his hospital course wound through multiple Sydney institutions over the years that followed, while doctors tried every available therapy. His friends, including Jimmy Galvin, watched him fade through years of slow decline, and the case became a fixture in Australian media as the family kept telling Sam's story to anyone who would listen. The case ended up in international medical literature as a documented warning about slug ingestion and unwashed produce, but for the Ballard family, the medicine was beside the point. Sam died on November 2nd, 2018, 8 years and a few months after the dare. He was 28 years old. His last spoken words to his mother were, "I love you," murmured before he slipped into the silence he never came back from. Faridabad cysticercosis seizure. When an 18-year-old walked into a Harania emergency room complaining of seizures, the MRI revealed his brain was so densely packed with parasitic cysts that doctors couldn't treat him without killing him faster. He was a young man, otherwise healthy, who had come in with new-onset seizures and growing pain at ESIC Medical College and Hospital in Faridabad, India. The first scan changed everything. Cysts were scattered across his cerebral cortex and brainstem, including the cerebellum, every one of them a larval form of Taenia solium, the pork tapeworm, the result of swallowing eggs from food contaminated with human feces. The path to disseminated cysticercosis doesn't require eating pork at all. The eggs travel through the fecal-oral route, which is one of the reasons the parasite is so difficult to control in regions where sanitation and hand washing aren't reliably available. Further imaging showed the cysts weren't limited to his brain. They were also in his eyes, his tongue, and his skeletal muscles, embedded in tissue across his entire body. The cyst burden was so massive that the standard treatments, albendazole and praziquantel, would have triggered a catastrophic inflammatory response, as the dying larvae released their contents inside his brain, swelling and compressing tissue that was already barely tolerating the parasitic load. The cure would have killed him faster than the disease. His attending physicians, Dr. Nishant Dev and Dr. S. Zafar Abbas, made the only safe call they could. They put him on dexamethasone for the inflammation and anti-epileptic drugs for the seizures, and they hoped that hedging against the symptoms might buy him enough time for his immune system to find some kind of equilibrium with the infection. 2 weeks after he walked into the emergency room, he died. The case was published in the New England Journal of Medicine on March 28, 2019, and it became one of the most widely cited teaching examples in modern parasitology, a clinical reminder that some infections become unsurvivable, not because medicine doesn't exist, but because the body can no longer survive the treatment. The MRI images, when they were finally released to the public, showed his brain studded with hundreds of cysts, like a star map, every one of them a tiny parasite the doctors had no safe way to kill. Texas campground Negleria. A 71-year-old Texas woman used the faucet on her recreational vehicle to rinse her sinuses, and 4 days later, her brain was being eaten alive. She was previously healthy, staying at a Texas campground, and the routine she'd built around her sinus care was the kind millions of people perform without thinking twice. She filled a nasal irrigation device with non-boiled tap water straight from the RV's onboard faucet, and she did it more than once over 4 days, rinsing her nasal passages each time, the same simple practice that doctors recommend for everything from allergies to recurring infections. The first warnings came fast. fever, headache, an altered mental state that her family couldn't quite name at first. Within 4 days of her first rinse, she was sick enough to need emergency care, and the physicians who saw her recognized the pattern they'd been dreading. They suspected primary amoebic meningoencephalitis, the rare, almost universally fatal infection caused by Naegleria fowleri, the so-called brain-eating amoeba that lives in warm, fresh water and travels up the olfactory nerve when water is forced into the nose. The mortality rate exceeds 97%. There are only a handful of documented survivors anywhere in the world, and the survivors are usually children who got aggressive experimental therapy within hours of symptom onset. Treatment for suspected Naegleria began immediately, but the seizures came and the deterioration accelerated faster than the protocols could keep up. She died 8 days after her first symptom, and the CDC confirmed Naegleria fowleri in her cerebrospinal fluid through laboratory testing of the samples taken before she lost consciousness. Texas Department of State Health Services investigators arrived 23 days later to test the campground's water system. They couldn't find the amoeba anymore. They did find that the water supply had not been adequately disinfected, and somewhere in those pipes, the killer had simply moved on. By the way, if you find this kind of documentation useful, I cover stories like these regularly. Consider subscribing if you'd like to see more. Thanks. Pennsylvania donor, strongyloidiasis. A 24-year-old gunshot victim's heart, liver, kidneys, and pancreas saved 4 lives in 2012, except his organs were also carrying a parasite that would attack his recipients from the inside out. The donor was a young Puerto Rico-born man who had died after a 9-day hospitalization following multiple gunshot wounds. He had been healthy by every measure that mattered to the transplant team, and his organs went to 4 people the next day. Pre-transplant screening didn't include Strongyloides serology, so the parasite, a nematode called Strongyloides stercoralis, went undetected. The 59-year-old man who received the donor's heart did well at first. Then, at about 7 weeks after the transplant, he developed a respiratory illness, and a bronchoscopy revealed something nobody on the team had expected to see: live Strongyloides larvae actively migrating through his lungs. The immunosuppressive drugs that protected his new heart had also given the parasite a free runway. Hyperinfection syndrome had set in. Doctors started ivermectin and albendazole, and they fought hard. But his weakened immune system was overrun by sequential bacterial infections that crossed into his nervous system. Life support stretched on for 4 weeks while the team worked the case. Eventually, they took him off, and he died. He wasn't the only one. The liver recipient had separately died on post-operative day 4 from a cardiac arrest of undetermined cause, which the autopsy could not link to strongyloides. But the kidney-pancreas recipient developed his own hyperinfection 9 weeks in. And the broader follow-up analysis later determined that 2 of the 4 organ recipients died of strongyloidiasis complications. CDC and UNOS responded by recommending serologic screening for donors from endemic regions. The case was published in MMWR in April 2013. Inside a Pennsylvania ICU, a man was given a new heart so he could live, and the gift came packaged with a worm that had been waiting in those tissues longer than anyone knew. Japanese-Brazilian Chagas collapse. A 48-year-old man had been working in Japan for 7 years when he collapsed at his job, and the parasite that killed him had been waiting in his heart since he was a child in Brazil. He was a Brazilian national who had relocated for work, the kind of decades-long migration story that doesn't usually appear in autopsy reports. On an ordinary workday in Japan, with no warning to him or anyone around him, he collapsed. He was pronounced dead at the scene. Because the cause of death was unknown in a non-endemic country, a forensic autopsy was ordered, and the findings told a story that had taken 30 years to write. His heart was dilated and enlarged, sized and weighted out of proportion to a healthy organ. His esophagus and his large intestine were moderately dilated as well. There was extensive interstitial inflammation in the cardiac muscle, the unmistakable signature of chronic Chagas cardiomyopathy. Postmortem serology confirmed the diagnosis. Indirect immunofluorescence antibody testing on his blood revealed IgG antibodies specific to Trypanosoma cruzi, the parasitic protozoan transmitted in rural Latin America through the bite of a triatomine bug, often called the kissing bug. He had almost certainly been infected as a child, decades before, and the parasite had quietly remodeled his heart year after year until the muscle could no longer do its job. The official cause of death was chronic cardiomyopathy caused by Chagas disease. The case was published in the journal Legal Medicine in 2010 and became a teaching example for Japanese pathologists confronting imported parasitic disease in migrant patients. He'd lived with the parasite for so long that nobody, not even him, knew it was there. And on an ordinary day in an ordinary workplace, the worm that had been quietly eating his heart finished the job. Niger schistosomiasis bladder. A 38-year-old woman in Niger walked into a clinic with chronic pelvic pain and bloody urine, and by the time anyone understood what was eating her, the parasite had been laying eggs in her bladder wall for 15 years. She had been living with months of pelvic pain and visible blood in her urine, both symptoms common enough that they'd been minimized and worked around as long as they remained tolerable, and the initial workup at her regional teaching hospital found a bladder mass. The biopsy was definitive: advanced stage squamous cell carcinoma, the kind of bladder cancer rarely seen in industrialized countries. And embedded throughout the tumor were schistosoma hematobium eggs, the calcified residue of years of fluke egg deposition that had quietly remade the tissue around them. The blood fluke had entered her body during freshwater contact in childhood, swimming or bathing or simply collecting water from a slow-moving river where the snail intermediate host had released the parasite's free-swimming larvae. The parasite had then migrated to her bladder wall and laid eggs there for decades, triggering chronic inflammation that the International Agency for Research on Cancer classifies as a Group 1 carcinogen, meaning the link between this parasite and human cancer is as solid as any link in oncology. By the time she sought care, the cancer was inoperable, and ureteral compression had pushed her into acute renal insufficiency. Palliative chemotherapy was attempted, but the disease had already metastasized beyond surgical reach. A 37-year-old man at the same hospital with the same diagnosis faced the same prognosis. Both patients died. Two parallel cases of cancer, driven by a parasite acquired in early childhood, and patiently kept alive by daily contact with contaminated freshwater. The cases were published in 2022, part of an ongoing global literature on schistosomiasis-associated bladder cancer that WHO estimates currently infects 250 million people worldwide. Somewhere in their childhoods, both of them had waded into the same kind of slow African water, and the worms that swam up into their bladders had taken 25 years to finish what they'd started. Seattle neti pot, Balamuthia. A 69-year-old Seattle woman used her neti pot every day for a month to clear a stubborn sinus infection, and a year later, her surgeon held a piece of her brain in his hand and said it was just dead tissue. She had a lingering sinus infection that her doctors had told her to manage with daily nasal irrigation, the same low-tech treatment recommended to millions of people every year. She filled her neti pot at her bathroom sink, using filtered tap water not sterile or distilled, and she ran the rinses for about a month. Then, a red sore appeared on the bridge of her nose. Her doctors initially treated it as rosacea, and the months ticked on. About a year after the first symptoms, she suffered a seizure at home and was rushed to Swedish Medical Center in Seattle. Neurosurgeon Dr. Charles Cobbs opened her skull and found a section of brain tissue roughly the size of a golf ball that was, in his words, just dead brain tissue, a bloody mush where her cerebral cortex had been. Biopsy and CDC laboratory analysis confirmed the cause: Balamuthia mandrillaris, a free-living amoeba that survives in soil and fresh water, had crawled up through her nasal cavity, established itself in her brain, and slowly devoured the surrounding tissue. The CDC confirmed the organism's presence in both the brain sample and the original nasal rash, and the case was published in the International Journal of Infectious Diseases in 2018. Balamuthia mandrillaris kills more than 90% of the people it infects, and only a handful of survivors have ever been documented worldwide. The CDC reinforced its guidance that nasal irrigation requires distilled, sterile, or boiled water, and the case drew renewed scrutiny of household tap water as a vector for free-living amoebas. Her surgeon pulled a tumor-sized piece of her brain out of her skull, and it was already gone, dissolved by an organism that had crawled up through the same bathroom faucet she'd trusted for years. If you'd like to see more videos like this, make sure to subscribe, and feel free to drop suggestions for the next video in the comments.